We are back. Sam Seder on the Majority Report on the phone, ladies and gentlemen. Perhaps, and I don't want to hurt anybody's feelings, but perhaps. So I'm going to say I'm going to give myself some wiggle room just in case I ever get called on this. But on the phone is perhaps my favorite guest that we have on the program. One of my favorite writers of some incredibly bizarre stories and fascinating stories. He is reported all around the world. Writer for Rolling Stone, best-selling author of the most recent Arms and the Dudes. And here to talk about, among other things, because he also did some reporting in the Balkans, an insurance salesman and a doctor walk into a bar and end up at the North Pole, which you can find. We have a link to it in the New York Times Magazine of the past week. Guy Lawson, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me, Sam, and let's just italicize that perhaps.
Yeah, it's exactly. We're just gonna, we got to put a little bit of asterisk next to it, just because I don't want to offend. I don't want to, run into another guest and have them say, like, I thought I was your favorite guest. Although I don't think I've ever said that.
I don't want Sarah Silverman thinking that, or Janine, or anybody.
Right,
like
exactly. Now, I have to say, also, let's just start off with this here. Folks, follow Guy on Facebook and Twitter. We have the links at majority.fm. Guy is a sort of a classic, not great a promoter. I noticed that on your email, Guy, it still says that Arms and the Dude, you can pre-order it.
Yeah, I'm afraid this whole culture of self-promotion just kind of leaves some of us in the dust. I'm doing my best.
I know. But
the technology thing, this whole internet thing is really, I think it's going to catch on. I really believe in it.
There you have it, folks. There's some investment advice. So if you have an opportunity to get into this internet thing. All right, let's talk about this piece because, one, I'm psyched to just talk about something that I find really interesting in a myriad of ways that isn't about politics. But then we got to talk politics because you walked amongst us as if you're one of us, but you're actually Canadian, and so you have an interesting perspective on things.
Fifth column.
Exactly. All right. Well, so the story of this North Pole expedition, which, as you dug into it, you found may have been the first expedition there by just a guy. It started in a bar?
Yeah. So my wife says to me a few months ago, why don't you write a happy story just once in your life? Just find a happy story. Because I've been writing about prisoners and criminals and wars and everything for years and years, crime. So my agent said, he's also my buddy, he said, why don't you do an adventure story? So I literally Googled adventure stories. And it comes up with Mount Everest, the moon, the South Pole, and one of them was the North Pole. So I just clicked on the North Pole. I'm just reading about it, and it says that this guy, Robert Peary, got there in 1909, and he looks exactly like you'd expect the first guy to get to the North Pole to look like, with his fur and his beard and black and white, kind of, etched out photograph. But then it says, but he was almost certainly lying in his logs. He couldn't possibly have done what he claimed to have done. So I'm like, huh. And then it says Frederick Cook got there, and he was the other guy that claimed to have got there, but he was also lying. So now I'm thinking, well, maybe I'll do a story about all the people that lie about going to the North Pole. And then I asked the question, well, who was first? And I'm reading along, and I'm like half an hour into it, and then there's this reference to this guy named Ralph Playstead. And it's sort of referred to as a joking aside. It says, actually the first person to get to the North Pole was Ralph Playstead with his buddies from Minnesota in 1968 on snowmobiles. And I'm like, oh my God. And I'm in Minnesota a week later talking to the families, going through their basements and digging out boxes. And it's not that he was maybe the first expedition to get there. He was the first expedition to get there. And the only one in that time was objectively verified and true to, and it's a true story. So it's an amazing story of a bunch of Minnesota suburban dads on a bar bet going to the North Pole, which sounds sort of goofy and easy, but in fact was really pretty dangerous and difficult.
Well, yeah, I mean, these guys really had not gone on expeditions before. I mean, he was...
No, I mean, they're knuckleheads.
Well, all right, so it's talk about the just start with that they had written that my favorite, well, one of the parts of this I love is the notion of that book that Plaisted wrote, or I don't know if he
participated in.
yeah.
Yeah.
Just it's First to the Pole. Is that the name of the book?
Yeah, and it's a classic. It's just a classic example of how a great story can be buried inside a not very well told, book.
But why does it start off with "This is a work of fiction," and then the first words in the book are "This is a true story"?
I think it's just because the publisher is this tiny little outfit in St. Cloud, Minnesota, and they just wanted to avoid any liability. And there's lots of factual errors in the book, and a lot of the people involved, the family members, are upset about the book, and it just didn't do the justice to the expedition. National Geographic had wanted to write the story, and that would have, of course, guaranteed them a place in history and legitimacy, but they'd been really disrespectful in the beginning of Plaisted when he went to meet with him in Washington. They told him that a bunch of his cronies just couldn't go off to the North Pole, and he said, you can, in great Midwestern style, said, you can just sit there and watch me. So he had an antagonistic, 10th grade dropout relationship with the establishment, which was really harmed their ability to get recognition, not to mention the fact they went on snowmobiles. They didn't use dogs and sleds and stuff. So, but inside that First to the Pole was the kernel of an amazing tale, and I was able to verify it through journals and letters and talking to surviving members of the expedition. And, there's this true story that emerges that it's like the anti-expedition. Expeditions in historical terms are like, you suffer, you go out onto the ice and you're there for months, if not years, and you nearly starve and you have to eat the dogs, and you come back emaciated and you're a hero. And these guys had no desire to suffer on their expedition. They had every desire to have it as easy as they could. So they had air support, they had beer and steaks and smokes brought to them out as they progressed to the North Pole. I mean, it's kind of like a parody, but at the heart of it, when you get further into it, as you know, Sam, from reading it, you discover that these guys really were heroic.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like there was a certain amount of suffering, but it also, I mean, these guys, they just stumbled through this, but they also did it multiple times, right? I mean, they failed the first time.
The first time they go to the North Pole, they're out on the ice for the first day. They've never been in the Arctic before. Ralph takes the lead, and he starts aiming towards this iceberg in the distance. Within an hour, because it's difficult to keep your sense of direction in the magnetic north, and the ice has very few landmarks, and it's a really tough place to navigate. Within an hour, they were heading south. I mean,
wrong direction.
About like you and I would do if we set out, Sam. It's just like a couple of dudes, a bunch of guys in snowmobiles, just wee. But they figured it out. They they got defeated the first year, and they, rather than sort of skulk away, they came back, and the next year they triumphed.
And what was also interesting, well, that part about him sort of, walking into the National Geographic offices in New York and them looking at him like, you're just an insurance salesman from Minnesota. Yeah. You're not going to do this. What I found really interesting about it too was just sort of like, you'd imagine that there would be that someone would have taken it upon themselves to write a definitive history of who was at the North Pole first. I mean, that's a fairly big deal. But because of his relationship with the gatekeepers of this type of information, it's completely submerged. I mean, I don't know. Maybe I'm just, They held this, the Naval Academy in Washington and Maryland. They had a huge seminar on Peary and the authenticity. But the New York Times and the National Geographic Society had sponsored Peary in 1909. Peary was a friend of Teddy Roosevelt. He was a national hero in his day. The irony here is that the authentic hero, which is, Robert Peary, the guy who did it the real way, was a fraud. Right.
And the inauthentic guy on snowmobile told the truth.
And
And so,
history, I mean, it gives you a good example of how history is sort of made and written. I mean, you would think this is a fairly sort of objective thing where you wouldn't have, but it really is a sort of proximity to the institutions that keep these records that creates reality.
well, and narratives that conform to pre-expectations.
Right.
You know, if you are like a mustachioed insurance salesman from Minnesota, somehow your life is less authentic, less even valuable than some lying dude from 100 years ago who was able to fool, and not just fool, but because they wanted to believe him. He was able to prey upon the vanity of his sponsors and the glories of this golden age. And another thing to say is like the age of exploration and the age of discovery has not ended. And one of the things that astonished me most was the lack of that no one else had taken upon themselves to actually try to go find out what the heck happened.
Yeah.
I mean, I couldn't believe I was first to the boxes, so to speak.
Yes. I mean, that's the thing. It's amazing. When this happened 40 years ago, 50 years ago now.
Yeah. The kids are their kids are our age, kind of thing.
And what also sort of shocked me is that snowmobiles were first called ski-doos. This is where these were brand new. I mean, that's what people have to understand. The snowmobile technology, and I guess I never really even contemplated it too much because I'm not terribly involved in snowmobile life. But these, like you say, were just basically like lawnmowers that you could ride.
That's right. And they'd have to go over these huge ice ridges and carry them up and over and go around, and then they'd come across these patches of open water, and they were lunatics. They'd speed across it. I mean, if something went wrong, it was 10,000 feet down, in minus 60 temperatures. So there is. I mean, if people check it out, and it's in the New York Times up on their website, and you can get to it my Facebook page. But if people read it, you'll see that they kind of came to a pact. We're gonna get there or die trying.
Did they have like photographs? Let me just ask you this one thing. Like when you met with the kids, like Walt Peterson's son, who was Peterson was one of the guys on there, and he's the last one alive, right?
Peterson he's the last one who made the whole trip. There are other members of the expedition, one of which didn't make the whole trip, and some of the other guys are from base camp. But he's the last one that did the whole thing. He's very ill. He's 88 and very, very ill.
But when you talk to his son, like, did they have like photographs? Did they have
totally these shrines? Yeah, I mean, this is a you go to the garage or the basement of these kids out in Minneapolis as I did, and they're all like, why are these things not in the Smithsonian? Why does no one care about this? And the story of that is that Ralph was enormously egotistical. He was difficult, and he had a low attention span, so after he didn't get the recognition, he just gave up and moved on to other things. And I think a lot of it, too, though, is about, the historical correct way to be a hero. And this is a story of an anti-expedition. This is a story of, of the 21st century. I don't know, I guess it's just sort of an ironic tale, but, it's a ripping yarn.
Yeah, and I love the part about where Peterson's son told you that they all took psychological tests to determine their suitability for this. They all failed. All right, I want to move on to some other stuff, but people should go check out this story. It's awesome. And someone just IM'd me, I should say, that the name Ski-Doo came from a typo. They wanted to call the company.
Dog.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah. I'm Canadian. It was Bombardier. It was a Canadian company. It's one of those things where, like you have these words that you use that no one in America can understand. And I refer to snowmobiles as Ski-Doos because that brand was so prominent in Canada.
Wow.
Ski dog.
All right. Well, let's talk. I want to get to U.S. politics, but today it was reported. I guess this happened. I don't know if this happened today in Europe or yesterday, but the former Bosnian Serb leader Radovan Karadzic, and I may be pronouncing that wrong.
Karadzic.
Was sentenced and found guilty, but he was sentenced to 40 years in jail for being criminally responsible for the 95 genocide in Srebrenica, which I'm not also not pronouncing correctly.
You got it. You're pretty good.
But this is the highest ranking, I guess. I mean, I don't know. Can you call it official or at least leader who has now been sentenced to jail because, Milosevic died before I guess he could be. But you did some reporting in the Balkans, and your buddy Scott Anderson, who was on this program for the Lawrence of Arabia. In Arabia. Tell me, put this in some type of context for us.
Yeah, well, I think the biggest way to think about it is that you listen to these politicians talk about Muslims and Middle Eastern peoples as it being uniquely bloodthirsty and, ethnically and culturally violent. You remember there was genocide occurring in the heart of Europe within our lifetime. And the Balkans was a bloodbath. And this guy Karadzic was not just like a war criminal. He was a kind of to the Serbian people, they had this spasm of extreme nationalism after the downfall of the Eastern Bloc and, Yugoslavia disintegrating. He was held up as a hero. I mean, he was, lots of people provided him sustenance and hid him out for many years in the Balkans. This guy who had been responsible for the murder of thousands of innocent civilians in the Balkans. I covered the Serbian war with ethnically Albanian people in Kosovo shortly after this. But my buddy Scott Anderson, a war correspondent, kind of a career one, he and a few of his friends went in search of Karadzic after he was in hiding, and they went up into the mountains. And the funny thing about it was they were just a bunch of journalists just kind of having a reunion and a kind of a joke. They weren't expecting to find him. They got mistaken for CIA guys, and all of a sudden they were being harassed and chased around these places by these Balkan thugs. But it shows you that there was a culture of very often in these kinds of situations, ethnic violence. There's a lot of self-pity underneath it, and the Serbians had a narrative of self-pity, and they had a narrative that they'd been the victims of this, of the Croatians and the Albanians and everyone closing in on them, and ultimately the Americans. And Karadzic was seen as like somebody who stood up for the Serb people. And I'm sure you have ethnically Serbian listeners, and I'm sure they're getting offended even now. But the fact of the matter is that crimes were committed, and then those criminals were given succor in those countries. And it's useful to remember that this was Europe, and only 20 years ago.
Right. I mean, it is amazing how that's sort of been erased from I don't know, from history in some respects. I mean, it hasn't been erased, but it doesn't. It is almost a relentless sort of narrative now, and maybe part of that is because of Trump, but there's also nominally people on the sort of like liberal left, supposedly, like Sam Harris types, who I don't even know if you're aware of. Are making this argument that there's something fundamentally wrong with Islam that creates this type of violence, I guess.
Here's a thought for you. The United States of America, as a government, without a declaration, went and murdered maybe 500,000 or more Vietnamese.
Well, I mean,
on a false pretext. I mean, if you really want to talk about
domino
one
theory.
Society having...
I mean, come on.
No, I know, but my
Right.
point being, though, that the idea that violence perpetrated against the West is uniquely one-sided, or that there's like no moral equivalence between these things strikes me as absurd. And to label Muslims as like uniquely violent is certifiably insane.
Well, you just say that because you're Canadian.
Well, there you go. If you think you got a problem with
But
Muslims,
what do you make
Canadians.
that? What do you make to that argument of the argument that they would say was, well, when we killed those Vietnamese civilians, that wasn't our goal. Our goal was not to do that.
Right.
Our goal was to fight.
Carpet bombing by accident.
Well, we just thought that there were people just who were on the wrong carpet or something like that. I mean, that was not the agenda. If we could have avoided civilian casualties, we would have. I mean, what honestly?
The one thing about being in conflict zones is that it teaches you just a lot about the power of violence and how terrifying it really is. And anybody who's, you will not find people who've been in war zones lightly going off to war.
Right.
You just won't. And that's Donald Trump. Talk about chicken hawks. How many exemptions or whatever did he have? And he's just ready. And Ted Cruz. These guys are just, and Hillary Clinton as well, I would argue. These people who have really no experience of this kind of collective violence find it, is the first resort.
Right.
It kind of is astonishing to me that the rhetoric of this country is so unself-reflective. That's not to make excuses for these lunatics, man. I mean, I was living in New York for 9/11. I saw the towers go down. That was an incredibly awful, awful time, and all the years since, I don't think this country's recovered.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I mean, I think that I think that in some ways it's metastasized at the very least in the Republican Party, but I think sort of more broadly speaking, that scar has not just not healed. It's sort of like getting a little gangrengy around the edges.
I was in Damascus a couple of years ago for Rolling Stone. I interviewed Omar bin Laden, the son of Osama. Omar had been up in the mountains of Afghanistan with his father. He'd been out in the desert in Africa with him, and of course he'd been in Saudi Arabia and all throughout. It was his father. And I could just take a little digression to note that the night I met him in Damascus, he took me out to a strip club. So that was an unexpected turn of events. He wanted to go, but he said to me, "Look, my father is winning. This is what he wanted."
Right. Just that is dragging the U.S. into a conflict where they couldn't get out of in some ways.
Yeah, to draw them in, as ISIS continues to want to try to do, but also to appeal to that part, the panicked part, the terrorized part of society, which of course Donald Trump is a master at accessing. That's basically his whole campaign.
Indeed, and it seems to only be resonating amongst Republicans at this point. I mean, who knows what happens when it turns to the general election? But if I'm always sort of suspicious of like hypothetical poll matchups, but his unfavorability rating is going up in the Republican Party, and it's going down in the rest of normal America. But I do want to note.
Yeah, but I think that there's a way that the establishment in the Republican Party, and now you're going to find in America, sort of wishes this away. Everyone's going to wake up one day and realize he's a a buffoon or
right.
something. But I'm not sure that's true. I'm really not sure that's true. I did something interesting this week, Sam. I was in Midtown Manhattan with a buddy of mine, and he has a kid in college, a freshman. He actually lives in Australia. And I thought his kid's kind of a cool kid, and I thought, it would be really funny to walk around campus in Australia as a freshman with a "Make America Great Again" cap on. I just thought that would be a really funny thing to give a kid. So I went shopping for one. You can't buy one. They're not for sale. And I went into all these stores, and here's why. All the trinket stores and the hat stores and the tourist stores in New York City, or the vast majority, are run by Muslims.
Yeah.
And they were furious. I went in and said, "Hey," like jokey woke, big joke, ha ha, I got to make great American hat here. And they all just said, "What do you mean, make it great? Get out." They were angry.
Yeah.
And afraid.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I've mentioned on this program that Mila has, well, my daughter, but my 10-year-old daughter has a friend in school who is Muslim, who is talking in school about how her parents are worried that they may have to move out of the country.
Yeah, and my kids, same age as Mila's, they have a Muslim girl in their class, and they have this one boy who's like the notorious dummy boy, who's all pro Donald Trump, and Muslims should go home. And I said to my kids, "Why don't you go ask him what Sana should do? Should Sana go home? Where's home for Sana?" That's the little Muslim girl.
And what happened? Now there's a huge.
Well, I didn't make them go do it. I just, rhetorically. It's astonishing that this has entered the discourse. Ted Cruz, they're going to surveil Muslims. How's that going to work? How are you going to tell?
Well, I don't know how. I guess you'd have to have a new type of federal police, right? I mean, you'd have to have a special squad of the FBI that would,
So
I mean,
and my wife has brown skin, so what? She'd be like presumed Muslim until what?
well, yeah, I mean, does she have problems when she flies?
No, no, not at all. But we were in Morocco a bunch of years ago, and everyone just kind of assumed she was Moroccan.
Right.
If you put her down in Egypt, they think she's Egyptian. She happens to be Indian, half Indian, and she just has a skin tone that could be anywhere from Morocco to Bangladesh.
And so, what I mean, when you talk to like folks who are, I don't know how many peeps you talk to in Canada, but I mean, what is the perspective there? I noticed your buddy Trudeau said that he could work with Trump. I imagine you sort of have to say that, right?
He didn't quite say that. He said he didn't quite say that. What he said is he has faith in the American people.
Right.
Which every Canadian knows is saying you can't be really going to elect that dude. But
well, you have to, as a leader, you have to say you can't like mess with other people's politics, right? I mean, theoretically, right?
I mean, I think the answer to your question is not. I don't have to speculate. I can tell you how they would respond and what they think. During the recent Canadian election, which Justin Trudeau, won a very sweeping majority, there was a crucial moment in that election. Stephen Harper had been the Prime Minister of Canada for a decade or so. He had run on essentially Islamophobic terms, and had done nothing to let Syrian refugees into Canada, even though it's a nation of immigrants, and has always accepted war refugees as a fundamental part of national identity in Canada. And there was a little boy who washed up on the shores of Turkey. And he had family in Canada, and he and his family were trying to escape from Syria, and this little 4-year-old boy died. He drowned in this this lethal attempt to escape. And this became a huge issue in the country because under a different regime, he may well have been in Canada instead of on a beach dead. And there was a debate. And the three main candidates were on the stage. There was a left of center. Trudeau is more of a centrist, and then this right of center candidate. And they were talking about revoking citizenship from any Canadian who is found guilty, quote unquote, of terrorism, which, as you've seen in this country, material support and all those kinds of definitions can mean a lot of things, and it's a pretty broad-ranging accusation. Anyway, Harper said, well, as if it was obvious that there were lesser citizens of a country, that if you were, quote-unquote, a terrorist, which is code for Muslim, that you were a second-class citizen. And Trudeau stood up on this stage with this 10 years experienced prime minister and said, a Canadian is a Canadian is a Canadian. And you can't revoke citizenship. You can't choose who you get to honor as a Canadian, or as Stephen Harper called it, old stock, which means white. And that was a galvanizing moment in the Canadian election. That was the moment that things changed. And Trudeau went from running in, a sort of an even third place to far and away first place. It was a moment when Canadians kind of recaptured what it means to be Canadian. And this is not something that's like done through dog whistles or subterfuge. This is a direct political rhetoric of the Prime Minister of Canada. And I went up and wrote about it for the New York Times Magazine. And I have to say, as a Canadian, it was a moment where I really felt the country was bringing itself to its senses. So can the United States have a moment like that this cycle? Can Hillary Clinton, would she have the political courage to do that in the face of Donald Trump? I doubt it.
Well,
I honestly doubt it.
I mean, I think to a certain extent she gave a speech yesterday, I think it was, or 2 days ago, that was, sort of close to that. I just don't know that the issue is really that it would take that a politician could make that difference, right? I mean,
or that the American public would respond in the way.
Well, I think is the problem, is that there's something fundamentally different about the American, the American population writ large versus the Canadian one, and I'm not sure I have a sense of what that is, other than with all due respect to people from the South, a lot of Southerners. I mean, there's
a lot of things going on in this country that I think can explain it. And I read an interesting piece on 538 about yesterday, the Nate Silver's website, about why Donald Trump, and there's this kind of
I saw that
collective head scratching. Yeah, there's this collective head scratching going on, and I mean, some part of it's got to be that the country's getting browner, It's getting
some part of it.
Gay and lesbian, right?
Some part of it. Wait a second. Here, I got a poll that was taken at the beginning of March.
Yeah.
Percentage of each candidate's supporters who say whites losing out is a bigger problem in this country due to preferences for blacks and Hispanics. Then they say,
let me guess, Donald Trump 100.
that blacks and Hispanics losing. And this is Republican-leaning registered voters. 54% of Trump voters say yes. And,
Yeah.
then,
That's
what
that's an irrational thing. How do you assuage that? How do you address that?
I don't think you do. I mean, I think you just, slowly try and make sure that these people don't have the levers of power and let them slowly die out over generations. I mean,
to me, like what Trudeau did, because Canada, old stock Canada has the same thing, right? I mean, it's a lesser extent and has a different history, obviously, and a different political system. But on some level, I think it's really important to make it explicit, to talk about it, because if it comes in the form of polling rather than political rhetoric, it never gets dealt with, and people are never required to confront the reasons they're doing things and then to try to rationalize them. So, this is where Hillary Clinton and her sort of, the way she and her husband do this kind of like a third way Tony Blair form of politicking, which is, you never ever sort of take a stand on anything. Everything's trying to triangulate and attract that white voter. It can work in the short term, but I think in the long term it's not a great solution. And I think Trudeau took a different route. And I think Obama has to a significant extent as well.
Yeah, and I think, I think Clinton has been not as bad on that particular issue. Frankly, I think she's been pretty decent. But the problem I think that we have is that built into our political system, because of the nature of Congress and the Senate and the idea that you have these sort of so many different sets of agendas that, it's 42% of all Republican voters believe that. 42% of that party believe that, and not just believe it, are willing to say it to a pollster, right? So, God,
to a stranger.
Right, exactly. And I mean, they believe it. And so the problem is that those 42% are represented almost perfectly, by a bunch of Congress people who are in, our 15 districts where they're not going to lose to anybody ever unless they get outflanked on the right on these issues. And so these voters hear it reinforced by some people in their leadership. So it's not enough. Like, they're not going to listen to Hillary Clinton anyways, because frankly, I'm not convinced that if you ask this question and substituted women, that the numbers would be too far off from that as well. Like, men are losing out because women in the workplace are getting too, they're demanding more money and blah, 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 feminazis.
But some of it's not completely irrational, right? Like the transformation of the workplace, the loss of decent,
absolutely,
loss of decent jobs, path to a middle class, a high school education getting you to a place in life where you can. All these guys that did that North Pole expedition, all except a couple, were like high school guys.
Right.
Maybe finished high school, maybe didn't. Their generation, that could lead to a prosperous middle class existence, and that just doesn't happen anymore. And again, this is globalization. You can talk about big issues like that, but the point being that I think that these anxieties are not completely irrational, and so when you fail to address them through things like addressing the inequality of wealth and minimum wages and things like that, the irony, of course, is that do you think Donald Trump cares about the working people of America? Do you think,
he wants to make America great
again. Anything but Donald Trump? I mean, it's just so abject.
He wants to make America great again, Guy.
Yeah. You can buy a hat. Pity you can't get a hat like that in Midtown Manhattan. I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, it is sort of surprising that particularly like amongst those type of shops, which will jump on any meme out there.
Anything.
Yeah.
Yeah.
but I guess it just makes it that much more valuable to get it on. I mean, to a certain extent, you could say what's going on in Midtown Manhattan is Sharia because they will not sell those hats.
That's right. Donald Trump would turn that into something like that.
Right. They just
Donald Trump would open 50 hat shops. Oh, no, you know what he'd do? He'd have someone else do it, and then he'd lend his name to it because he actually doesn't do anything anymore. He just brands it.
He would just brand it, of course. Well,
and he'd say it's worth $10 billion.
There you go. Guy Lawson, always a pleasure. What is your Twitter handle again? Isn't it like a weird one? Like, didn't you get into this so late?
You tried to get me a proper one. It's Guy Lawson 2, Guylawson 2.
Oh, did
Facebook...
Did you score 2? Because I thought you were like at like. You got into that so late. Like we had to drag you into getting a Twitter handle. I thought it was like Guy Lawson 534789A.
No, Guy Lawson at AOL, right?
Right. Guy Lawson 2. And what's your Facebook page? Is it Guy Lawson?
It's just Guy Lawson author. That's where I actually post. I go on Twitter once in a while, but not really. I mean, I just can't. I don't know. I mean, I like long-form journalism, and I like talking to you, Sam, because we can actually have a conversation instead of like a little 1-minute soundbite.
I know. You go on. I know.
That's part of the pleasure.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, they don't when you go on like CBS or the morning show or whatever. They rush you in, rush you out. They just want to put makeup on you, buddy.
Yeah, no. I was on there one time on I think it was MSNBC, and they said to me, "So this is my arms dealing book," and they said. So you're trying to tell me that the Pentagon is deliberately proliferating weapons into the Middle East and Afghanistan that are less than good quality, and this is what they mean to do? And I said, yes. And the host just looked at me like, we'll go to commercial.
Oh, geez.
It's actually up on YouTube. I think it's called something like, watch a journalist try to tell TV hosts, something like what political reality is, and it's really pretty funny.
Oh, we got to get that.
In a tragic way.
We got to play. We'll play that on the show. Guy, we'll talk to you soon. Guy Lawson, everybody. Thanks so much, Guy.
Thanks, Sam. Ciao.
Hi, I'm Sam Seder, and this is an Ann Coulter doll.
You should not be immigrating here. Yeah. Stay in your country and hate us.
For smart progressive talk and a little bit of this and even a little bit of that.
Mission accomplished.
Subscribe to our podcast, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and like us on Facebook to get some of our best video clips.